Lucinda poured the concentrated foxglove syrup into the infant's morning porridge while the nursery was silent. The only sound was the heavy, wet heat of a Georgia morning pressing against the window panes, and the soft, rhythmic breathing of a child who didn't know his own mother was his executioner. She planned to bury the air by sunset and hang the woman forced to feed him before the moon rose over the plantation. But the mistress forgot one simple thing. Euphemia had already found the blue glass vial hidden in the nursery hearth, and she knew exactly what that bitter smell meant. The baby's heart was slowing down with every spoonful, and the rope was already being prepared for the wrong person. Stay until the end to see how a single chipped bottle strips a powerful family of their name, their land, and their freedom. The Hollingsworth estate wasn't built on kindness. It was built on the kind of secrets that stay buried under the red clay for generations. In the 1850s, a name like Hollingsworth meant something in Georgia. It meant power, it meant vast fields of white gold, and it meant a reputation that was supposed to be untouchable. Sterling Hollingsworth walked the halls with the stride of a man who owned the world. But he was blind. He was blinded by the soft silk dresses of his wife, Lucinda, and the perceived fragility of a woman who claimed she couldn't even stand the sight of a crushed insect. Look closely at this. Some folks call it high society, but it's really just cold-blooded cruelty wrapped in a family name. Euphemia stood in the corner of the nursery, her back straight and her eyes lowered. To the Hollingsworths, she was part of the furniture. She was the
wet nurse, a woman brought into the big house because her own milk was the only thing keeping the young master, little Thomas, alive. But Euphemia was more than a nurse. She was 34 years old and had spent every one of those years learning how to survive by watching what people didn't think she was seeing. She had a specialized knowledge of the roots that grew in the swampy edges of the property. She knew which ones cured a fever and which ones could make a man's stomach turn inside out. Most importantly, she had a sense of smell that could detect a single drop of bitter almond in a gallon of milk. For weeks, Euphemia had noticed the change. Lucinda Hollingsworth didn't visit the nursery out of motherly love. She came with a purpose. She would dismiss the other houseworkers, claiming she needed quiet time with her son. But every time she left, the air in the room carried a faint metallic tang. It was the smell of foxglove, a plant that was beautiful to look at, but carried a heart-topping poison in its leaves. Euphemia watched the baby. Thomas was once a vibrant, screaming child, but lately he had become lethargic. His skin was turning a pale, ghostly blue around the lips. His pulse, when Euphemia checked it in the middle of the night, was slow and thumping like a tired drum. The reason for this cold calculation was simple: greed. Lucinda's brother, Julian, was a man who had gambled away his soul in the parlors of Savannah. He owed debts that the Hollingsworth name couldn't cover without dipping into the massive inheritance set aside for the male heir. If Thomas died, the trust would revert to Lucinda, and from Lucinda it would flow directly into Julian's pockets to pay off the men who were threatening to burn his world down. The atmosphere in the house was thick with more than just humidity. It was the smell of a trap being set. Lucinda knew she couldn't just let the baby die and expect no questions. She needed a villain. She needed someone to point the finger at when the doctor arrived and found the child's heart had simply given out. And who better than the silent, observant woman who spent every waking hour with the boy? Euphemia was the perfect target. She was a woman of color. She was property in the eyes of the law, and she had no voice that the major or the magistrate would ever listen to. The first move in Lucinda's chess match happened on Tuesday. The sun was beating down on the porch when Lucinda walked into the nursery, her face a mask of feigned concern. She didn't look at the baby first. She looked at Euphemia. With a sudden, sharp movement, she reached out and slapped Euphemia across the face. The sound cracked like a whip in the quiet room. Lucinda didn't stop there. She began to scream, her voice high and trembling, calling for Sterling. She accused Euphemia of tainting the nursery with bad luck and charms from the quarters. She claimed she had found strange marks on the floor and that the baby was sickly because of Euphemia's dark influence. It was a calculated performance. Lucinda wanted the other houseworkers to hear. She wanted a documented history of Euphemia's negligence and wickedness, so that when the final blow came, it would look like a long time coming. Sterling Hollingsworth burst into the room, his face red from the heat and his own arrogance. He didn't ask questions. He looked at his fragile wife in tears and his silent nurse, and he believed the lie. He didn't see the way Lucinda's eyes stayed cold even as she sobbed into her handkerchief. But Euphemia didn't break. She didn't cry out. She felt the sting on her cheek, but her mind was already moving 3 steps ahead. She knew that a slap was just the beginning. A killer always keeps the bottle until they are sure the heart has stopped. They need to keep the source close in case they need one last dose to finish the job. That morning, while Lucinda was busy playing the victim for her husband, Euphemia had been cleaning the nursery hearth. Deep in the soot, tucked behind a loose brick that shouldn't have been loose, her fingers had closed around something cold and smooth. It was a small, blue-tinted glass vial with a chipped rim. It was an expensive item, something from a high-end apothecary in the city, not something a worker would ever possess. When Euphemia uncorked it, the smell confirmed her worst fears. It was the concentrated syrup of foxglove. It was the medicine Lucinda was using to slowly drain the life out of her own flesh and blood. Euphemia tucked the vial into the hidden pocket of her apron. She knew that if she was caught with it, it would be her death warrant. But if she didn't have it, she had no shield against the storm that was coming. If you can't stand these well-dressed lies, make sure you're subscribed to the channel. Tell me, was that blue glass bottle a warning, or was it already a death sentence? The tension in the Hollingsworth house reached a breaking point as evening approached. Lucinda's brother, Julian, had been seen at the gate, his horse lathered in sweat. He was waiting for the news. He was waiting for the tragedy that would save his skin. Inside, Lucinda was preparing the final dose. She was done with the slow decay. She wanted the inheritance now. She ordered Euphemia to prepare a special bowl of porridge for the baby, claiming it was a strengthening tonic. She had prepared herself. Euphemia looked at the bowl. She could see the slight separation in the liquid, the way the syrup didn't quite mix with the oats. She knew that if Thomas ate this, he wouldn't wake up for his midnight feeding. She also knew that Lucinda had already planted a bag of poisonous hemlock roots under Euphemia's mattress in the quarters. The trap was fully formed. The mistress would discover the roots, the baby would die, and Euphemia would be handed over to the major for a public execution before the week was out. But Lucinda underestimated the woman she thought was invisible. Euphemia didn't go to her cabin to hide. She didn't try to run. Running was for the guilty, and Euphemia was something much more dangerous. She was the witness. She watched from the shadows as Lucinda went to the hearth to retrieve her blue vial, only to find the soot-covered space empty. For the first time, Euphemia saw a flicker of real fear on the mistress's face. It wasn't the fear of a mother losing a child. It was the fear of a murderer losing their weapon. The baby started to cough. It was a weak, wet sound that barely carried across the room. Lucinda panicked. She grabbed the porridge bowl, intending to force-feed the child herself if she had to. She needed the heart to stop now, before the major arrived for his scheduled dinner with Sterling. The major, Silas Thistlewood, was a man who took pride in his logic. He was a veteran who believed in evidence, and Lucinda knew she had to present him with a dead body and a clear culprit the moment he stepped foot on the property. Euphemia walked like a ghost through the back hallways. She knew she couldn't stop Lucinda by force. She was one woman against the power of the Hollingsworth name, but she had the vial, and she had the truth. She also knew that Zadok, the elderly stable hand, had seen Julian delivering more of that medicine in the dead of night. The pieces were there, but they were scattered. Euphemia had to be the one to pull them together before the child drew his last breath. As the sun began to dip below the horizon, casting long, bloody shadows across the plantation, the front gates opened. Major Thistlewood's carriage was arriving. The clock had run out. Lucinda stood over the cradle, the spoon trembling in her hand, the poisoned porridge ready. She looked toward the door, expecting to see her husband. Instead, she saw Euphemia standing there, silent and steady, with her hand resting on the hidden weight in her apron pocket. The two women locked eyes, and for a second, the mask slipped. Lucinda realized that the silent nurse wasn't just watching the baby, she was watching her. The air in the nursery was thick, you could barely breathe. The baby let out a soft moan, his little chest struggling for air. Lucinda's face twisted into a snarl, the pretense of the fragile flower evaporating in the heat of her desperation. She knew the major was downstairs, she knew her brother was at the fence, and she knew that if she didn't finish this now, the debts would swallow her whole. She raised the spoon to the baby's lips, but Euphemia didn't move to stop her physically. She simply spoke one word, the first time she had broken her silence in days. It wasn't a plea, it was a sentence. Subscribe here. We dig up what they tried to bury deep. And tell me in the comments, do you think Sterling really didn't know, or did he just find it easier to look the other way? The heart doesn't stop because of fate, it stops because of a dose.
But if it was found in Euphemia's belongings, the problem solved itself. Notice this. Some people call this tradition, but it's really just cold-blooded cruelty with a first and last name. The first wave of the attack didn't come with words. It came with a search. Lucinda called for the overseer and her husband, her voice cracking with a perfectly practiced tremor. She claimed her jewelry had been stolen, a heavy gold brooch and a string of pearls. It was a classic move, the oldest trick in the book to justify tearing apart the quarters. Sterling, fueled by a mix of brandy and his own inflated sense of justice, didn't hesitate. He ordered every cabin searched. He wanted the thief dragged out before dinner was served. He didn't see the way Lucinda's eyes scanned Euphemia's face, looking for a flinch, a bead of sweat, or a sign of panic. Euphemia stood by the nursery cradle, her hands folded over her apron. She felt the weight of the blue vial against her hip. She knew the cabins were being ransacked. She knew that Lucinda had already planted a bag of hemlock roots under her straw mattress earlier that morning. The gold brooch wouldn't be found, but the witchcraft would. In 1850, a black woman found with poisonous roots was as good as dead. The law wouldn't ask if she was a healer. They would assume she was a killer. Euphemia listened to the distant sounds of doors being kicked in and chests being overturned. Her heart was a steady rhythm in her chest, a stark contrast to the shallow, fluttering pulse of the baby lying in the cradle next to her. The baby, Thomas, was dying. It wasn't a quick death. The foxglove syrup was doing its work, slowing the electrical signals in his tiny heart until it was nothing more than a sluggish pump. His skin was the color of damp ash. Euphemia looked at the child and felt a cold, hard anger rising in her throat. She wasn't just fighting for her own life anymore. She was the only thing standing between this infant and a grave marked with a family name that didn't deserve him. She had the vial, but she couldn't show it yet. If she brought it out now, Sterling would say she stole it. She needed a witness who mattered. She needed the major. But before she could even think of a move, the overseer returned. He wasn't carrying gold. He was carrying a small, grimy burlap sack filled with dried, grayish roots. He dropped them on the rug in front of Sterling and the major. Lucinda let out a gasped sob, clutching her throat. She pointed a shaking finger at Euphemia. She didn't have to say a word. The evidence of Euphemia's wickedness was right there on the floor. Sterling's face turned a shade of purple that matched the bruises he was about to inflict. He didn't wait for a trial. He didn't ask for an explanation. He grabbed Euphemia by the arm and dragged her toward the cooling cellar behind the kitchen. The cooling cellar was a hole in the earth lined with stone and used to keep meat from rotting in the Georgia heat. It was dark, damp, and smelled of salt and old blood. Sterling threw her inside and slammed the heavy oak door, bolting it from the outside. "You'll stay there until the magistrate arrives," he barked, "and then you'll hang for what you've done to my son." Euphemia sat on the cold stone floor, the darkness swallowing her whole. She could hear the rats moving in the corners and the sound of her own breathing. She was trapped. She was isolated, and the baby was still upstairs with the woman who wanted him dead. If you don't swallow these well-dressed lies, subscribe and tell me, was that blue vial a warning or was it already a sentence? Inside the dark cellar, Euphemia didn't panic. She reached into her hidden pocket and felt the smooth glass of the vial. It was still there. Lucinda had missed it because she was too busy planting her own fake evidence. But Euphemia knew that being right didn't mean staying alive. She looked at the small high vent in the cellar wall, just a sliver of moonlight breaking through. She needed to get out. She knew that Lucinda would use this time to give the baby the final dose. With Euphemia locked away, there was no one to stop her, and no one to blame but the witch in the cellar. The second wave of the escalation started with a sound. It was the sound of a horse's hooves muffled by the grass. Euphemia pressed her ear to the damp wall. She heard a low whistle. It was Zadok, the stable hand. Zadok was old, his back bent from years of labor, but his eyes saw everything. He had seen Lucinda's brother, Julian, lurking near the smokehouse. He had seen the exchange of money, and he knew that Euphemia was the only person in that house who had ever treated him like a human being. "Euphemia," he whispered through the vent. "The baby, he ain't breathing right. The mistress is in there now with a bowl. She sent the master to the gate to meet the major." Euphemia felt a jolt of ice water run down her spine. The final dose. Lucinda was finishing it. "Zadok, listen to me," she hissed back. "You have to get the major, not the master, the major. Tell him there's a secret in the nursery hearth. Tell him to look for the blue glass." She knew she was gambling. If Zadok was caught talking to the major, he'd be whipped, but if he didn't, the baby was dead. The old man hesitated. Fear is a heavy chain, especially for a man who has seen what happens to those who speak out of turn. But Zadok looked toward the big house, toward the flickering lights of the nursery, and he remembered the way Euphemia had saved his own grandson from the croup the winter before. He nodded, a sharp, jerky movement in the shadows, and disappeared into the night. Euphemia was alone again. She looked at the door. It was bolted from the outside, but the wood was old. The humidity had swollen the frame. She began to look around the cellar, her hands searching the floor for anything she could use. She found a heavy iron hook used for hanging hams. It was rusted, but solid. She began to dig at the mortar around the door hinge. Every scrape of metal against stone sounded like a thunderclap in her ears. She worked with a desperate rhythmic intensity. Her fingers were bleeding, the salt from the meat hook stinging her cuts, but she didn't stop. Upstairs, the baby was turning blue. Upstairs, the mother was a monster. Suddenly, a scream ripped through the night. It wasn't the scream of a child. It was Lucinda. It was a high, theatrical wail of grief. Euphemia froze. Had she been too late? Had the heart already stopped? The sound of heavy footsteps pounded across the porch above. Sterling's voice was a roar of confusion and pain. "Thomas, my boy!" The house was in chaos. This was Lucinda's moment. She would claim the baby died while the witch was in the cellar, proving that Euphemia had used a long-distance curse. It was the perfect ending to her perfect lie. But Euphemia finally felt the hinge give way. With one final agonizing heave, she pulled the iron hook and the stone crumbled. The door groaned. She pushed with her shoulder, the damp wood resisting, until with a crack of splintering oak, it swung open just a few inches. She squeezed through the rough stone, tearing at her dress and skin. She was out. She was in the night air, her lungs burning. She didn't run for the woods. She didn't run for freedom. She ran straight toward the back stairs of the big house. She reached the nursery door just as Major Thistlewood and Sterling were entering from the main hall. Lucinda was hunched over the cradle, her face buried in her hands, her shoulders shaking with sobs. The bowl of porridge sat empty on the bedside table. The room smelled of lavender and something bitter. The foxglove. Euphemia stepped into the light, her face covered in soot and blood, her eyes fixed on the major. "He's not gone yet," Euphemia said, her voice low and steady. The room went silent. Sterling looked at her like she was a ghost. Lucinda bolted upright, her eyes wide with a mix of fury and terror. "How dare you?" she shrieked. "You killed him. You put the roots in your bed." Euphemia didn't look at her. She walked straight to the cradle and picked up the limp, silent body of the child. She reached into her apron and pulled out a different root, one she had kept hidden in her hair. A stimulant, a root that could jumpstart a heart if it hadn't been stopped for too long. Subscribe here. We pull up what they tried to bury. And tell me, do you think everyone in that house was blind, or were they just looking for an excuse to blame the nurse? The Major watched with a cold, analytical eye as the wet nurse defied the master of the house. He saw the way Lucinda's hand flew to the empty porridge bowl, trying to pull it away from the light. He saw the way Zadok was standing in the shadows of the hallway, his hat in his hands, his
lips moving in a silent prayer. The game had changed. The truth was no longer hidden under the red clay. It was standing in the middle of the nursery, covered in the dirt of the cellar, and it was refusing to die. Euphemia held the limp, ashen body of the Hollingsworth heir against her chest, her fingers pressing into the child's cold skin. The nursery was a tomb of silence, broken only by the heavy, ragged breathing of Sterling Hollingsworth and the frantic, high-pitched sobbing of his wife. Lucinda stood by the bed, her lace handkerchief pressed to her mouth, her eyes darting like a trapped animal's between her husband and the wet nurse who had just escaped a bolted cellar. The Major, Silas Thistlewood, stood near the door, his hand resting on the pommel of his sword, his eyes narrowing as he took in the scene. He was a man of cold logic, a man who had seen men die in the mud of Mexico, and he knew the smell of a lie when it was thick in the air. Look at this. The truth doesn't need to scream. It just needs to wait for the air to clear so everyone can see the rot underneath. The baby wasn't breathing. To anyone else, little Thomas was already gone, a victim of the vapors or sudden infant death that took so many children in the heat of the South. But Euphemia knew better. She knew the foxglove didn't just kill. It paralyzed the heart's rhythm until the body forgot how to live. She reached into her hidden apron pocket and pulled out a small, gnarled piece of root she had carried for years, a stimulant so powerful it could bring a man back from the edge of the abyss. She didn't ask for permission. She didn't look at Sterling. She bit off a small piece, chewed it into a paste, and smeared it directly onto the infant's pale gums. "What are you doing to him?" Lucinda shrieked, her voice cracking like glass. "Sterling, stop her! She's using her roots on him again!" "She's finishing the job." Lucinda lunged forward, her fingers clawing at Euphemia's arm, but Sterling caught her. He was a man torn in two. He looked at the witchcraft roots the overseer had found in the quarters, and then he looked at his son's lifeless face. He wanted to believe his wife, but something in Euphemia's silence, something in her calm, steady movements made him hesitate. For 60 agonizing seconds, nothing happened. The Major stepped closer, his boots heavy on the floorboards. He looked at the bowl of porridge sitting on the nightstand, the one Lucinda had been holding when they entered. He noticed a faint, oily sheen on the surface of the milk. Then a sound. It was a sharp, wet gasp. The baby's chest jerked. A tiny, raspy cry broke the silence of the room. Thomas was breathing. The skin around his lips began to flush with a faint, healthy pink. Euphemia didn't smile. She didn't celebrate. She simply handed the child to the stunned father and stepped back into the shadows. Lucinda's face didn't show relief. For a split second, a flash of pure, unadulterated rage crossed her features before she masked it back into motherly concern. She tried to take the baby from Sterling, her hands shaking. "Give him to me," she pleaded. "He needs his mother. He's been through so much horror." But the Major moved faster. He placed a hand on the bowl of porridge and pulled it toward the light of the oil lamp. He wasn't looking at the baby anymore. He was looking at the liquid. "Major, please," Lucinda said, her voice dropping to a whisper. "The child is exhausted. We should let him rest. And this woman needs to be taken back to the cellar. She's dangerous." She reached for the bowl, her movements frantic, but she was clumsy in her desperation. Her sleeve caught the edge of the nightstand, and as she reached out, the Major grabbed her wrist. He didn't do it with violence, but with the firm grip of a man making an arrest. He held her hand up to the light, and that's when the room went cold. Lucinda's fingertips were stained, not with soot and not with dirt. They were stained with a faint translucent blue residue, the same color as the glass of the vial Euphemia had hidden. It was the mark of a rare apothecary syrup, something that didn't wash off easily with water. The Major looked from the blue stains to the empty porridge bowl, and then to Euphemia, who remained as still as a statue against the wall. He knew what foxglove did. He knew that in high doses it was a weapon. If you don't swallow these well-dressed lies, subscribe, and tell me, was that blue vial a warning, or was it already a sentence? The situation was spiraling. Outside, the sound of a horse galloping away from the estate echoed through the night. It was Julian, Lucinda's brother. He had been waiting by the smokehouse for the signal that the heir was dead and the inheritance was secure. When he saw the lights moving frantically in the nursery and heard the baby's cry, he knew the plan had failed. He didn't stay to defend his sister. He fled toward the county line, leaving her to face the consequences alone. Sterling Hollingsworth looked at his wife's hand, then at the Major, and finally at Euphemia. The realization was beginning to sink in, a slow, agonizing poison of its own. He saw the fragile woman he had married for her status and her beauty, and for the first time he saw the predator underneath the silk. "Lucinda," he whispered, his voice trembling, "what is on your hands?" Lucinda didn't answer. She pulled her arm back and backed away toward the fireplace. Her eyes were wide, scanning the room for an exit, for a weapon, for another lie. She saw the bowl of porridge, and with a sudden violent movement, she kicked the small table, sending the bowl
flying across the room. It shattered against the hearth, the poisoned oats splattering across the bricks. "It was her!" she screamed, pointing at Euphemia. "She poisoned the porridge. She must have spilled the medicine on me when I tried to stop her." It was a desperate move. By destroying the bowl, she thought she had destroyed the evidence. She thought that without the liquid to test, it would be her word against the slaves. But she had forgotten the one thing Euphemia had been holding on to since the morning. Euphemia stepped forward, her hand reaching into her apron. She didn't pull out a route this time. She pulled out the small, blue-tinted glass vial with the chipped rim. The room went deathly silent. The Major took the bottle from Euphemia's hand, his eyes never leaving Lucinda's face. He uncorked it and took a cautious sniff. The bitter metallic scent of concentrated foxglove filled the air. "This wasn't in the quarters, Sterling," the Major said, his voice like iron. "I found the roots your overseer brought in. They were hemlock. But this is foxglove, and it's not something a wet nurse can buy in a shop. It's an expensive poison used for heart ailments in tiny drops. This vial is nearly empty." Lucinda's knees buckled. She fell back against the mantel, her face as white as the lace on her collar. She looked at Euphemia with a hatred so deep it could have burned the house down. She realized then that Euphemia hadn't just escaped the cellar. She had orchestrated the entire exposure. Euphemia had moved the vial. She had waited for the Major to be present. She had saved the baby, not just for the sake of the child, but to ensure there was a living witness to Lucinda's failure. "I did it for us," Lucinda hissed, her voice dropping into a low, jagged growl. She wasn't talking to the Major anymore. She was talking to Sterling. "Julian would have lost everything. We would have been dragged into the streets. The bank was coming for the land, Sterling. Do you think your pride would have fed us?" She was no longer the victim. She was the architect of a tragedy that had been averted by a woman she considered less than human.
Sterling looked at his wife as if he was seeing a monster for the first time. He looked at the baby in his arms, the child who would have been dead by morning if not for the woman he had thrown into a hole in the earth. The weight of his own arrogance, his own blindness, seemed to crush him.
The Major walked Euphemia to the carriage. "You saved that boy," he said, his voice gruff. "And you saved me from making a terrible mistake with that rope. There are folks in the North, people I know, who have a different view of things than Sterling Hollingsworth. I've written a letter. You'll be safe there." He handed her a small purse of coins, the reward money that had been posted for the discovery of the thief in the house. It was a final irony that Lucinda's own fake robbery had provided the funds for Euphemia's departure. Sterling stood in the doorway, the baby in his arms, watching as the carriage pulled away. He didn't wave. He didn't speak. He was a man standing in the ruins of a life built on a lie, left to raise a son who would grow up knowing that his mother was a killer and his nurse was his savior. The Hollingsworth name was dead, even if the child lived. The lands would be sold, the house would fall into disrepair, and the red clay would eventually reclaim everything that Sterling thought made him powerful. Subscribe. Here we pull up what they tried to bury. And tell me, do you think everyone in that house was blind, or were they just looking for an excuse to blame the nurse? The heart doesn't stop because of fate. It stops because of a dose. Lucinda thought she was the one holding the spoon, but she was the one being fed her own lies. She died in a prison cell 2 years later, never having seen her brother or her son again. Julian vanished into the penal system, a man whose greed had cost him his name and his freedom. And Euphemia, she traveled far from the humid air of Georgia, moving toward a horizon where her knowledge was a gift, not a crime. She never served a mistress again. She lived her life knowing that while silk and stone can crumble, the truth is a root that grows even in the darkest soil. And once it takes hold, no lie can ever pull it out.